Hello and welcome to the 100-day Arts Challenge. This video is number 97 of 100, and as you can see here, this starts off with what looks like it's going to be a floral piece. That's what I think I intended initially, and I just didn't like the composition, and I felt as though I couldn't really justify the concept as something which was going to be flowers from imagination with this experimented leaf, grass, petal combination, which I just didn't think was working. So at that point, when I felt like giving up, I thought, why not just continue with these patterns but all over the page until it becomes an abstract piece and then see what happens. But it was still a floral concept, so it was from the jumping off point of it being flowers and leaves and grass from imagination, and that was the inspiration for it, was just seeing everything in bloom earlier in the year had created this spark in my mind of surely I can work with the colour composition of red and green and try to come up with something that sits on the page that's quite interesting and pleasant. When that became too unnatural and compositionally didn't work, I mixed this almost reddish brown, which I start to put onto the surface as well, and that becomes the catalyst for me filling in every white space that I can see. And it's not perfect. You can always, you always will miss something. But here's me drawing something on the surface, and this is from a reference that I found on Instagram. I would share the reference, but because I normally like to reach out to the person to let them know that I'm using them, and to be honest, it's not really much like the original image, what I end up making, so I thought I will just tell you that I do use a reference for what I'm drawing at the moment, but it's not really important how where it's actually from necessarily. But there we are. So I'm drawing a figure on top of this swirly mess that I've made on the surface, so it's a bit more of an experimental piece, but I just feel as though it would be interesting to try and do something which is a kind of combination of ideas, I suppose. First being that from imagination, and then turning into an improvisation, and then using reference on top to make that mixture of one with the other. I also drew in something on the side here which you won't see after a while. I start to remove it, which is something which the reference, the subject is resting on, and I end up removing that from the side, because as much as it's the model is posing in a way where her weight is leaning against something, I just decide against including those aspects of the image. And I think part of it is the idea that if she is adrift in this swirl of colour, then I don't see the necessity for introducing too many elements from reality, because I quite like the concept of an abstract piece with a figurative reference. And then obviously this piece is done in watercolour. This is my safest medium to use. I like to use this a lot for landscapes and for foliage, but for pieces like this, I don't have that much experience painting figures with watercolour. It's just not what I often do. I think it's just, normally if I'm going to use watercolour, I like the washy, diluted effect it has when it comes to doing plants and trees. I think it really lends itself naturally to that. And then for forms and figures, it's obviously just as well suited It's just that I don't use it that way often, or not often enough, I should say. At this point, I'm only adding the shadows, as you can tell here, to certain parts of the subject, just to try and describe the form in this abstract piece. And I quite like it like this, but I do eventually develop the piece so that it's a richer colour and so that it has more of a vivid form sitting on the picture plane, or in the picture plane I should say, and in this dreamlike state. But you can see here I'm creating a richer background texture here by adding blue to the background. It's very washy, watery blue, but I think it really complements the patterns in the background to create this watery, washy blue tone, because it does seem as though the swirls and the state of mind of the subject are awash in some kind of sea of dreamlike thought and emotion. So having the background reflect that seemed like a naturally complementary decision to make. And at this point I quite like it because it's so subtle, but I do keep working on it. Perhaps I shouldn't have, perhaps I should just have darkened certain areas, but I do keep strengthening the tone and pulling back certain parts. And you can see here I'm using water to then wash away certain stronger elements of the initial colour. And I quite like doing that with watercolour. I like the fact that you can push around certain parts of the paint that's already laid down, and I thought I will give her a warmer skin tone and start to colour in certain parts of the painting that were incredibly abstract. So I've started to develop the concept into something a bit more conventional. As I said, I lose the abstract initial idea and I start to push into something a bit more traditional and easier to read. In the future I may not do that. I think I've lost something in the painting that was initially quite a nice idea, but I also gain the experience of pushing through the abstraction into what I end up with, which is an experience that I think you need to have sometimes just to see what happens and how it works. These paintings can always go much further than they actually do. I sometimes hold back a little bit because of the challenge, constraints upon my time and concentration. And I know that in the future I will explore different creative avenues of making art that I'm currently not doing, and yet still this is like a sketch every day, which I still appreciate and think has its value. So it doesn't necessarily cheapen the art, it just means that it doesn't have the full potential of time and reflection that art sometimes needs, often needs I would say. Plus there's other things happening in life which create a complicated dynamic between the impulse to create art and the need to do other things. So that's why these pieces are sometimes made in a direction that I don't regret, but I certainly reflect on differently, and look forward to having longer with a painting than I currently have. I think after the challenge is finished I'm going to try and make a video where I spend a week on a painting and publish that, and then a month on a painting, every day painting on the same piece, and then showing what happens, and then longer and longer, and showing how that development affects the work. That's what I'm looking forward to. But this has offered a lot regarding experience and idea generation, And as you can see, I added certain darker elements to the piece, and certain parts need to be softer and certain other things need to be strengthened in certain ways. But so long as I can describe something in this swirly background, I'm quite happy that at least there is a form developing there. And that's what I feel is starting to build. Or it's not starting to build, I'm actually finishing up the piece. It's obviously still a very loose sketch, but I think it's quite pleasant and it still reflects on an emotional state where you're almost daydreaming or reflecting on the day. And that's what I do here with this piece. It's nothing like the reference at all, so the reference doesn't factor into a lot of the development of this piece. It's certainly why I don't feel as though it's as relevant to share that image alongside this piece. Instead, I'd rather show you where it ends up rather than where it started. But from the floral beginnings of this piece into this unusual sketch, I think is an interesting submission, not like any other that I've done, and this is the piece that I've made. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, I will see you tomorrow.